Welcome everyone to the Nastel Technologies Tech Talk. Today's topic is running multiple versions in WebSphere MQ 7.1 and 7.5. Our speaker today is Richard Nicula, VP of Engineering at Nastel Technologies. Today's session will be recorded and available on demand on our website tomorrow. Richard, take it.
This is one of several tech talks that we've done on 7.1 and 7.5. We started with an introduction. This is running multiple versions. We have 2 additional sessions, how to take advantage of new features and migration scenarios. In the introductory session, we covered the highlights of multiple version support. In this session, we're going to go into more details regarding it. So let's review, though, first, what is coexistence, multiple installation? The key component is that you actually now can install multiple versions of WebSphere MQ on the same server at the same time. This was something you could not do in the past. So now you can run multiple versions of 7.0.1.6 and higher, as well as one or more versions of 7.1 or 7.5 installations on the same system. There's a separate installation for each set of executables, although there can be shared data folders, a common MQSNE files, and the applications and the profiles that they're using determine in which queue managers they can access. The other point is the installation location is no longer fixed, allowing you to put MQ wherever you'd like on the system. Now, a couple of terminology points. You've heard me use the term installation already. Installation is a install of WebSphere MQ that has a name by which it's known, which could be names like installation 0, installation 1, or it could be more descriptive. You also have a primary installation. This is the installation to which applications are going to go by default based on the configuration of the system, such as symbolic links in Unix. If you have 7.0.1.6 or higher, this always has to be the primary installation. One other bit of terminology is the term coexistence generally refers to when running 7.0.1.6 and higher along with 7.1, whereas multiple installation support is running multiple versions of 7.1 and or 7.5. So let's look at a couple of the installation scenarios. We'll go through these relatively quickly. With AIX, it is a SMIT install, or there's a function called install P that you can use to do a non-interactive install. All of the installs require root access. Again, the default will install where MQ normally goes, but you can override that. In fact, you have to override that if you're going to do a coexistence install. You can either do that through install P or through a SMIT by picking the relocatable software installation option. For HPUX, you're going to use SW install, regardless of whether you're doing an interactive or non-interactive install. Again, must be logged in as root. And again, if you want to install, or I should say if you are going to install as a coexistent release, you must install with a changed folder. For installation on Solaris, the first thing to note is that when installing into global local zones, there are some specific considerations that you should review. Second is you're going to use a tool called CRT MQ package to create an interactive install, or there's a silent.sh for non-interactive installs. You must have root access and access to /var temp. Again, you want to change the installation directory if you're doing a coexistence install. That's done one of 2 ways, either by using package ask to create a response file, or replying no when asked to install in the default location during the install. For Windows, you're going to be running a setup.exe and then basically clicking next to walk through it. There are 2 options you'll want to watch. First, you want to do the install, leaving existing installation untouched. And then if you do want to override the installation folder, you'll want to do a custom install. However, it will default if you choose the first option to a folder other than the default Windows install. Installation on Linux is similar to installation on Solaris. You use the CRT MQ package to create the installation packages. Again, you must be logged in with root. And then in this case, you actually specify the location for the installation with the -- prefix option when running. And here's a sample of a Linux install. At the top you can see we're using the CRT-MQ package to create an installation package referencing suffix 2. It then runs through, creates a set of RPM files which are stored in var/temp/mqrpms, which you can see here we've listed out. At the bottom we're using RPM to install those packages, as well as specifying the prefix for the opt MQenv in this case. So let's look at some of the challenges of running a 701X coexistent release. First off, 701X is not multiple installation aware. That creates some specific requirements. First off, it has to be the primary installation. It does not support installation loading, which we're going to talk about in a moment. You can easily end up with mixed versions either because of profiles, paths, and other things not being set up properly. And the key thing is it limits the simplicity. Once you get past this, you have just 7.1 and 7.5. The multiple version support is much easier to work with. So let's look at some examples. Here's a DSP MQver command to display the version of MQ. On the left-hand side, you'll see that the resulting versions that were listed were just 7.0.1.8. On the right, however, you'll see that it listed both 7.5 as well as 7.0.1.8. Now these commands were actually invoked on the same system, but the difference was the command on the left was based off of installation 0 in this case, which was a 7.0.1 version, and the one on the right was actually done with a 7.5 installation. The 7.5 was aware of both the 7.5 as well as the 7.0 installation. So let's look at some examples of installation mismatches. Now, an installation mismatch is when you try to run a program or a command and the current installation that's being used is not the one that is needed to do that command. At the top, we've done a run MQSC to test one, and we've got a return message back, AMQ6292, indicating that the queue manager is associated with a different installation. The second one, we did an AMQ sget to simply get messages off of a queue off of test 1, and you can see it starting, and in this case we ended up with a return code 2583, which again is due to a mixed version installation. The next example is another AMQ sget against Q1, but this time to queue manager test 7.1 queue manager. You'll see in this case that the return code was a 2059. Well, this occurs when using a 7.0 installation and attempting to connect to a 7.1 queue manager. The next example, we're just running an MQ command here, and you'll see that we got a symbol lookup error, and it's telling you that it can't find some symbol. This is indicative that in fact that the path or LD library path is incorrectly set, so it's not actually able to find the installation that it needs to run the command. The next one is an MQM command, again another command, but in this case you'll see that it actually is a little bit more informative. It's actually able to tell us that the queue manager that we're trying to run the command against is actually associated with a different installation than the one that we're running. And then at the bottom I ran one command here. This is a DSP-MQ command to get the queue manager status. And you can see that the queue manager status for the MQ75 queue manager shows as status not available. Well, again, this is a command run with a 7.0.1 installation, and it has no way to know exactly what the status of a 7.5 queue manager is. Thus, you get the message status not available. So again, you want to always try to run with the 7.1 or higher libraries as your primary libraries because you're going to get the most information, and typically they'll support both 7.0 as well as 7.1 and 7.5. Now how you do that is with the setMQenv command. The setMQenv command basically sets the environment to match the queue manager or the installation that you need. On the Unix, Linux systems, you want to run this with a dot option to ensure that it applies to your shell, not just to the command when it runs. You can also use a create MQenv, which will display the current environment. This can be used to create a custom script to create your own scenarios so that you can actually, specify the configuration that you need for a specific environment. Now, you will find that there are a number of tools that are provided already through the support forums at IBM that actually have some advantages over these commands. One of those is the WMQ 7.1 profile script. And what this does is it actually creates a shell configuration change. This is going to be used on your Unix, Linux systems. And it has a couple of advantages. The first one is that it only has to be sourced once at login. The setMQ, you would have to do the dot sourcing every time to run it. It also creates a shell function called setMQenv, which is the same syntax as the normal setMQenv command, which means you can basically just now start using setMQenv as a command rather than as sourcing it. It also runs any additional commands from the user profile if there's one there, as well as supporting automatic command switches. And the automatic command switches will support the version mismatches that we saw in the previous example, where we saw this thing that said, well, this is not associated with this installation. Those will be addressed by using the WMQ 7.1 profile, since it creates shell equivalents for the MQ commands and then sets up the libraries accordingly. At the bottom is a link to go get this sample. One of the features I mentioned earlier was automatic installation loading. This allows a 7.1 or higher installation to dynamically load the libraries that are needed to connect to the queue manager that the application is trying to connect to. Now, in the example here, you'll see that I've got a coexistent release where I've got 7.01 and 7.1 libraries installed on the system, and I have two queue managers, QM1, which is using 7.1, and QM2 that is using 7.01. I also have two applications, application 1 on the left, which is using a 7.01 library, and application 2 on the right, which is set up to use 7.1 libraries. Now, when application 1 runs, it's only going to be able to connect to QM2 because that's the only 7.01 queue manager on the system. However, when application 2 runs, it's actually able to connect to both QM1 as well as QM2. And you'll notice here that in fact what happens is the 7.1 libraries determine that in fact the 7.01 libraries were needed in order to connect to QM2, and they're dynamically loaded, and it allows application 2 to connect to both queue managers as needed. Application 1, if it tried to connect to QM1, would actually get a 2059 failure. Now, here's a real-life usage of application loading. Now, this is our Autopilot On Demand for WebSphere product, and this product allows running in both an agent and an agentless configuration. But in this case, I'm using the agent-based configuration. And what you can see here is that I've connected that agent to both prod queue manager 1 as well as MQ7.5 queue manager. Now, prod queue manager, you can see out here from the details, has a command level of 7.01. It's a 7.01 queue manager. But if I then look at 7.5, you can see that in fact it is a 7.5 command level. So this single agent, because it's running with the 7.1 libraries, is actually able, or sorry, in this case 7.5 libraries, is able to connect to both the 7.5 queue managers as well as the 7.01 queue managers. So to get your compatibility options set up properly, you have a number of different choices. Depending on how you've set up, you may need to rebuild your program with the 7.1 or 7.5 libraries. Of course, you can use the setMQenv command that we mentioned earlier to point to the correct installation. You can use the setMQenv-I command to make a 7.1 the primary installation. However, that won't work if you still got 7.01. You're still doing installation or coexistence. You can install 7.1 into a default location. Again, that would imply you have no 7.01.x queue managers left. You can create links to satisfy the application environments that they need. or you could, if needed, you could actually modify the program's runtime library path. All of these are options that get the 7.1 libraries used instead of the 7.0.1 libraries because, again, as I mentioned earlier, they do limit what you can connect to. Now, here's an MQSINI file that's been set up that actually has two queue managers in it. You'll see that it has an installation 1, which has been set up for test queue manager, and then prod queue manager doesn't specify an installation. So we know right off the bat that this is a 7.0.1 queue manager because it's not associated with a specific installation, whereas the test queue manager here is in fact either a 7.1 or a 7.5 queue manager. Now, on Windows, your queue managers are going to continue to use the registry. However, once you've actually upgraded the last queue manager that's a 7.0.1 queue manager, it will actually stop using the registry and switch to an MQSINI file from that point forward. Okay. Okay. Now, it's important that you upgrade the queue manager. If you were just to delete the last 7.0x queue manager, it won't actually run the registry migration, and there's a command line version you can use to do that. Okay, so let's summarize what we did in this Tech Talk. We talked about the difference between coexistence with 7.0.1 as well as the multiple instance support with 7.1 and 7.5. We described how to install several of the different installations and where you would do the coexistent install. We talked about some of the challenges of running 7.0.1x in the environment. We talked about how to configure multiple installations for the best usage. Now, one of the topics that we'll talk about in an upcoming Tech Talk is migration strategies, because now, this was just coexistent release strategies. Now when we actually start talking about, migrating from 7.0.1 to 7.1 or 7.5, as well as strategies for applying maintenance to 7.1 and 7.5, which is one of the key reasons that multiple installation support exists, we will dedicate an entire Tech Talk to that. All right, so at this point we're going to, I've shown some links here that you can use to get more information about Nastel and our products and our support for WebsterMQ. I believe at this point, Charlie, turn it back over to you for leading the Q&A.
Great job. Very interesting information, Richard. So let's get those questions in, folks. Hope you've been thinking of those. See if we can stump Richard. So the first question we have here looks like someone's trying to get a twofer, actually a threefer. We have three related questions. If I am already rolling out 7.1 of WMQ, should I switch to 7.5? And should I plan on implementing 7.1 or 7.5? And then one more here. What are the major differences between 7.1 and 7.5, and which should I use? Richard?
Sure. Okay, well, let's see. I guess this is, you're right, this is a little bit tricky, but okay, so if you haven't started a rollout of 7.1, then the answer is pretty simple. You want to look at 7.5 because it's the most current version that's out there, and there aren't really any significant changes, so it's not like it's a, if you're going to introduce any risk by going to a 7.5 at this point. As we touched, and I guess going back to the features, as I said, 7.5 is primarily a repackaging release. There are a few miscellaneous features in it, but it's not significantly different. Now, if you've already started your 7.1 rollout, then that's where it starts to get harder, right? Because basically, 7.1 is supported. It's early. It's only been out a very short period of time. So you're not risking anything by saying, well, let me put 7.1 in to do that. So it really just depends on schedules and where you're at in your schedule, and whether you're willing to introduce change at this point and have to go through the process. I know for some people
you may have 6 months worth of work into rolling out and deploying a 6.1 or a 7.1 deployment. You're probably not going to stop it.
All right, folks. Other questions? Don't be shy. All right, here's another one. Can you clarify why WMQ 7.1 profile is required? Richard?
Sure. So the 7.1, the WMQ 7.1 profile is it basically has to do with setting up the environment with so that you have the right path or the right LD library path and so on set up. And so what it's doing is it's basically it's making it easier to do that. A lot of people, one of the challenges of the set MQenv out of the box is that you actually have to use the dot source to source it to the shell. And so what you're doing by using the WMQ profile is it's eliminating all of that. It also creates shell versions of all the MQ commands as an option, which allows you to basically enter like a DSP MQ command. It'll figure out based on the Q. Oh, sorry, that wouldn't be a good example. A run MQSC command. It'll figure out dynamically based on the queue manager you're doing which profile it needs to be using. So it just makes your life a lot easier. Avoids a lot of the confusion.
Okay. Looks like we have another question, Richard. This one goes like this. Can we install different versions of WMQ in local zones for Solaris? For example, 7.01.x and 7.5 in two different zones. Or should one be in the global zone and one in the local? Any insight into that?
Yeah, that's certainly right. I can certainly touch on that. I mentioned in the actually in the presentation that if you're going to be installing in Solaris, you do need to see the documentation. There are some very specific restrictions on how you can do things, specifically when you start playing with the global zone. The primary installation, so if we go back to installations, there is a concept of a primary installation. That's normally going to be handled through the global zones because that's where the default links and things are, so you're going to want to set that up in the global zone. And of course 7.0 has to be a primary, so that's going to, like I say, 7.01 X tends to limit the flexibility. But as far as being able to put the 7.5s in local zones, you can, as long as you're willing to live within the restrictions of what you can do to change and set them around. So yes, it certainly is possible.
All right. More questions, folks? Oh, here comes another one. All right. For installation loading, is there a way to prevent it from occurring? For example, let's say I don't want my applications connecting to an older version of WMQ.
So the answer is yes, if you did have a reason to do that, and there are a few that come up. Then there's an environment variable that you can set. It's a AMQ single installation environment variable, and it will prevent it from loading. So if again, it would be basically the same as if it didn't know that a version existed. It just won't load at that point. Now, one other question is that it doesn't necessarily just load older versions. That happened to be my example with 7.01, but it actually, the way that you could apply maintenance, the application loading could actually be loading a newer version of MQ. It's not just loading older versions.
All right, next one. Can we use the set MQenv command to go back and forth between two installations?
So yes, so the answer is that's exactly what the set MQenv command is for. It basically is to set up the configuration to match the installation that you want to use. So you can basically switch back and forth, to whatever installation that you want to use. Like I said, a lot depends on what you're trying to do with your installations. You don't have to be constantly switching, but But certainly the operations team and some of those you'll find that you have to. As I mentioned, for example, the run MQSC command by default, if you're not in the right installation, won't actually run. So an operations team or an administrator will probably be using setMQenv a lot.
Okay. You didn't mention Zeos, Richard. Does it also support coexistence?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for asking that one. You're right. I should have mentioned ZOS. ZOS has actually always supported multiple installations. So while yes, it supports it, it's not a specific feature of 7.1 or 7.5 support there.
All right. More questions, folks? All right, here comes another one. Are there any differences in OS version requirements for 7.5 versus 7.1?
No, I don't. I don't have the full list right in front of me. But in general, 7.5 has the same exact profile, I believe, for all platforms as 7.1. The only exception was ZOS, which they did not release a 7.5 version of because it wasn't needed.
All right. Here's an interesting one. When I install on Linux, the installation is called Installation 1. How do I create an instance using a more descriptive name?
That's another good question. Actually, that's the short answer is that when you do the initial installation, it's always going to be installation 1. So the first time you install a 7.1 or a 7.5, it's always going to be installation 1. However, once you've got a 7.1 or a 7.5 installation installed, then it actually installs a couple of new commands. So you actually get a command called DSP-MQinst, which allows you to display the current installations. The command to create an instance with a descriptive name is actually CRT-MQinst. And that creates an installation. Well, or better said, it creates an anchor for an installation. So I can actually go in and say create MQinst banking, and then it's going to create a placeholder for banking. Then when I actually run the installation, I can say I want this installation to be associated with banking. So after your first installation, then the later ones can have descriptive names. There's also a DLT MQinst to delete an instance. Let me see. Oh, a couple other notes on that. They do have to be run as root to both do the create and the delete. The display you can run as an MQM user. And for those of you who have inquiring minds, there is a file now called MQinst.ini file, which is actually stored out in etc opt MQM, which of course is why you have to have root access to run the command. On Windows, ignore all of this, because on Windows, when you actually run the setup.exe that we were showing earlier, you can actually specify the installation name right on the first install. So you don't it does still default to installation 1, but you can change that directly.
Okay. Interesting. Here's another one around installation. Can we have multiple installations of the same versions of 7.5?
Yes. Yes, you can do that. The installations, again, if you have a good reason for doing that, they can be the exact same versions, no problem. Right. The only thing, and I think we mentioned this last time, is that a queue manager is associated with just an installation. So, in that case, you could have, queue manager 1 is at 7.500 and queue manager 2 is at 7.500, but they could basically be using different installations. What that, of course, means is that at some point you could decide, okay, I need to put maintenance on. You could put maintenance on to to your first instance, your first installation, and then it would now be a higher level than the second and would no longer be in sync. But yes, they can certainly be completely in sync, no problem.
All right. Apparently this is an interesting subject. There's a lot of tricky details around all of these installation issues. Here's one around licensing. Are there any licensing issues or concerns if you're running multiple installations of MQ on a single node?
Well, I'm not an IBM licensing guy, so I'll first qualify the answer by saying that I'm not your IBM representative that can give you the exact details. But the short answer should be that your licensing should cover this. Again, you have to have licenses to run the tools. You should be licensed to do that, but certainly I would check with your IBM representative.
All right. More questions, folks? All right, here's another one. Do you have any plans to provide a webinar covering the new features of MQ 7.5, especially around security?
Yeah, we have. In fact, the next webinar coming up will touch on that. We've got a couple of different topics that we're going to talk on: the channel security and the changes to the security models and the dead letter queues. That's actually coming up in the next webinar, which I believe is scheduled roughly 4 weeks from now for the next MQ 7.5 webinar.
All right, the next one. All right, so we've gotten past the issue of installing this thing and licensing it. Now we've got it running. What is the resource impact when you're running multiple versions?
It's negligible because basically the only time that this comes in, the only thing that actually comes in at all is during MQ connection when you're connecting to a queue manager. That's going to be where the most of the features are going to be implemented that are going to impact a performance implication. Once you're connected to a queue manager, it's basically the same as it is today.
Okay. Well, I think we're coming to a close now. I want to thank everyone for attending, and thanks for the great questions. This session is being recorded, and it will be available on demand by tomorrow morning. So if you'd like to pass this link on to your colleagues, please feel free to do it. And if any of you have any questions about this, you can contact me. This is Charlie Rich. My email address is crich, R-I-C-H, at Nastel, Nastel.com. Thanks again, and be sure to check out the rest of our Tech Talk series. We have one of them roughly every 2 weeks covering technical topics in application performance. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.